Hello and welcome along to the latest episode of Edie's Susty Talk, our video interview series originally launched during lockdown 1 and designed to keep you feeling connected during however many lockdowns there are and beyond. Seeing as there's less than a month to go until our Sustainability Leaders Forum in early February, we're taking the chance to interview some of our expert speakers who are going to be appearing at the 3-day virtual conference, and I'm delighted to have Dan Neale on today from the World Benchmarking Alliance, the WBA, and he heads up their social transformation work. So Dan, thank you so much for coming on the call today.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
And pleasure to see you. I've had a couple of interviews with your colleagues at the Alliance over the past year or so, probably with like the leadership team and with the climate team. But just because it's your first time, would you tell us a bit more about your role and remit at the Alliance? I know that the work that the Alliance does, I love the diagram of it. If anyone hasn't seen it, it's a circle with social transformation in the middle and then all the other work sort of around the outside.
Sure. So I lead our social transformation work, and I suppose it's easy to say that we're focused on the SDGs. We're focused on benchmarking the 2,000 most influential companies in the world. And we see the world through a lens of 7 systems transformations, if you like. So we're talking about the food system, the urban system, the circular system, finance wrapping around the outside, and the energy system. And in the heart of that, the social transformation piece. So we are looking at universal human development delivered through the respect for human rights and enabling and empowering people to make the choices they value. What that really means is that the social transformation, we've committed that it has an impact and has a role within all of the other transformations themselves. And so when we talk about all of the other benchmarks, and energy is a really, really good example, if we look at an energy benchmark on decarbonisation, we could say we're focusing on how companies are aligning with the Paris Agreement and when they're going to go zero carbon, their current performance and where they're going. But the SDGs, one of the core principles of that is leaving no one behind. And so the social part is our overlay for that, to how do we make sure no one is left behind in that energy transformation. And so if we imagine that for a just transition to take place, it's not just the decarbonisation piece, but it's also looking at how people are going to be impacted by that transformation and how you deal with and manage those impacts as we go along. So the social piece on top of the climate piece is where we get to a just transition benchmark, and that's the overlay and overlap between the social. So my role is to look at how we're going to apply the social lens to all 2,000 companies. And then how we try and focus and drive impact in certain sort of spotlight areas within the social transformation. So one of the things we have is the corporate human rights benchmark. Mm-hmm. So I led that before I came to the WBA, and the CHRB has now been fully integrated into that 7 systems model. And that really focuses on a certain area and high risk sectors. Similarly, we have another spotlight that focuses on the gender benchmark, so gender empowerment and equality, which is a cross-cutting theme. It doesn't matter which sector you're in. Out of the 30 sectors we look at, doesn't matter which country you're in. We've got over 70 countries, or which transformation, because it supports and enables that work for the SDGs across those different transformations. The role, it only kicked off a year ago, and last year we kind of figured out what the social transformation meant for the World Benchmarking Alliance. And in about 11 days, we are launching the finalised framework for the social transformation during Davos week. And so on the 4th, we'll be actually kind of saying, OK, we've launched it. Here it is. This is what we're intending to do.
Oh, sounds like a really exciting time then. And I did want to say, when you talk about things like the just transition and about social transformation, obviously these concepts have been around for a long time. But we've heard them a lot more because of the events of 2020, and I wanted to get a handle on whether that's the feeling with you guys and what you've seen in interacting with the companies that you benchmark.
I think it was interesting doing the methodology development and the consultations during 2020. If we look at it's all the B's and C's, so Biden and biodiversity and Black Lives Matter and COVID and climate, all of these things are sort of coming together. And in some respects, to be a bit morbid, but it was quite useful because the window of debate opened up a certain degree. So no one was really pushing back and saying, "Oh, paid sick leave. We don't agree with that. That's a bit communist." No one was really pushing back at that level. People were being a bit open and honest, I think, about the fact that actually, yes, we rely in a large part on segments of society and key workers who aren't remunerated for their key work and the value that they provide to society. So I think that's kind of opened up the conversation a fair bit. It's also really made people more fundamentally aware of, we've ended up with markets which prize efficiency over everything. So we've gone from having redundancy and the ability to deal with shock, and so we don't need that, because what we need is a just-in-time supply chain. And I think some of the frailties of these extended opaque supply chains have really been brought to the fore in the last year. And I mean, on things like Black Lives Matter, that the movement, there's a mix. Then I think there's some companies that, yes, really have looked deep inside and kind of had a thought about it, and there are others that have jumped on the kind of virtue signaling bandwagon, and are very keen to support taking a knee, while at the same time maybe continuing to employ prison labor in the US, which is part of an entrenched racial inequality system. So I think it's mixed, and I think there's been a lot of noise, but not necessarily a huge revolution.
Mm-hmm. And in that noise, you've talked about how it's just easier to speak about social responsibilities, and the way that the profession and the way it's set up has been historically, people have always talked about silos, like here's our social impact over here and here's our environmental impact over here. And you talked about how the Alliance is working to bring those together, but are you seeing businesses now agreeing that there is interconnectivity and intersectionality as well?
I think to a degree, but I think it's slow progress.
Right.
I think there's more recognition, and so if you look at the human rights lens on climate, there's more of that convergence, I think, between the E and the S side. I mean, environment's a really interesting one, because environment and social aren't two sides of the same coin, and I can say this with my social hat on, but we're normally enlightened self-interest for environment. We're either interested in environment because the impact we're having on it as people, or the impact the environment has on us as people. And so there's bringing that people lens to it, I think, has definitely grown. And as you're saying there, that the just transition concept's been around for a while for environment, but is definitely picking up speed and attention as people are realizing things. And if we look at the Gilets jaunes in France, and that part of the response, if you like, to saying, okay, this is what we're going to do on climate, without bringing the people along, without recognizing that you're going to have huge impacts on people and their livelihoods, and if you don't address that, not only are you not going to have the transformation you want, but if you do get there, it's not going to bring people along with you. You're definitely going to leave people behind. And we can see that back to the Industrial Revolution and any big kind of change, that we need to bring that social lens to deal with the problems. And that interconnectedness is definitely there, but I think a lot of systems and approaches and things so far have been built that focus on narrow areas rather than looking at things as a whole. And that's one of the benefits of the WBA's approach, is that we do take this sort of systems approach, and you can't just boil it down to one topic or one company or one sector or SDG by SDG, because the things are interconnected. So if you take living wage, for example, if you deal with living wages, there are so many things that come off that. So you deal with the fact that, actually, so much child labour is dependent on the fact that people are in poverty wages and they need the children to work in that space. If the children are not in work, then actually they can go into the education piece that goes with that. And then if you can bring in the fact that living wages require equal pay for equal work, and start looking at addressing gender inequality in that piece. And if there is equal pay for equal work on the gender piece, it means actually freed up time from childcare and the benefits that go into that piece. So there's a lot of the topics which address multiple areas, and I think that there is more understanding that you don't. It's not best to just go straight in on one narrow small topic.
It's like a domino effect, really, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's figuring out which ones you're going to flick. And on the social consultations and the transformation piece, social is everything to everyone, which means there's nothing to anybody either. So it was a bit like playing Guess Who. We're like, what are all the things that we could look at on the social transformation? It was like, okay, not that, not that, not that, not that. And we're kind of flicking them all down to figure out where we should really focus. And because we're looking at companies, and it wasn't necessarily what is a single social system that needs to be transformed or an economic system that needs to be transformed. We said we'll focus on the 2,000 companies themselves, and particularly their role kind of in society and their social responsibility, because that underpins and enables all those other transformations we want to see, if we want those transformations to be ones that leave no one behind.
Mm-hmm. Great, and I just wanted to come on to the topic that you're going to be focusing on at the forum. So you're going to be taking part in a workshop on sustainability reporting. And obviously by having transparency and good disclosure, it doesn't in and of itself bring about that systems change or even improve performance in a silo. But I did want to touch on that, because disclosure on social sustainability or human rights does not seem to be very good at the moment. I know that the Alliance's human rights benchmark for 2020 painted a less than rosy picture. You can look up our coverage on our site, but essentially it analysed 229 major companies, and around half were unable to prove that they're protecting human rights in line with the UN's requirements, and around a third just got a score of 0. And I'm sure that a lot of that was down to non-disclosure rather than disclosing terrible information. So how can businesses turn the tide on this year?
Sure. I mean, it's a mix as well. And I would say with the human rights piece, that we have a very stringent kind of methodology that's in there, and there are a lot of companies that are not disclosing what they do on respect for human rights, for instance. But I should say that the disclosure is an intrinsic part of demonstrating respect for human rights. It's part of that process that we expect to see. So it's not that companies can legitimately say, yeah, we're doing all that, we just don't talk about it. That's not a legitimate argument. So if they're not engaging with stakeholders, if they're not informing people about what they're doing, then they're not actually then really sort of respecting human rights in the first place. So it's not just a disclosure problem. In the past, we've also seen plenty of companies who say, well, we do much more than we say. And the counter narrative is, well, you say much more than you do. And the truth lies somewhere in between those. Mm-hmm. So we do see companies that join or get put into the benchmark for the first time. This was the 4th year. They do score very low. In the next few years, how they improve is a mix of changing the way they disclose and then changing the way that they do business. And it is quite difficult sometimes to look into that, because you'd really have to go and audit a company and go right throughout and figure out what it is that they're doing. So it's a mixed one on what companies can do. I think, we have a publicly available methodology. It's there, anyone can look at it and they can figure out exactly how the scoring works. So companies that want to try and game the system, as one of the things that people push at us, they can try and look at that and figure out how they could disclose new information, which we don't mind, because if they're disclosing new information, it's all substantive information about how they approach their respect for human rights. So that's a good thing. But they can also see then what the framework looks like in terms of how they can improve their processes for respect for human rights. In terms of what companies can do, I would say that the low scores generally reflect that most companies haven't embedded the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. They haven't embedded within their business operations the fact that they have responsibilities to respect human rights, and they should be conducting proper due diligence that goes through their supply chains and their value chains, and they should be acting on that and disclosing on it, and they should be providing remedy when things go wrong. So aside from the whole disclosure piece, I think that the big thing is that companies should be meeting their pre-existing societal expectations. So this soft international law around the UNGPs, there's a growing number of companies that have got national action plans. There's a growing number of countries and regions that are looking at things like mandatory human rights due diligence. So I think companies should recognise that this definitely isn't going away, and those companies that are performing poorly on things like the benchmarks, or would perform poorly if they applied the methodology, should really be looking at how they are, how they're implementing and meeting these societal expectations already.
Mm-hmm. I did notice when we were discussing earlier that you did mention progress on the E and the S, but the G was notably absent from your sentence.
And it was one of the things when we kind of said we've got social at the middle and we focused on S indicators, the S being the kind of the poor cousin historically in terms of sustainability disclosures in particular. So some people think that the G side, yeah, there's more work to do, but in terms of disclosures and things, there's quite a lot of work that's already happened on there. Environmental, yeah, there's more disclosure that needs to happen, particularly around the climate piece. But again, it's far in advance of the social element, and partly, this ties into the difficulties around some of the S stuff. So social, it's a lot easier to talk about what you've done rather than what the impacts of that were. And it is not the easiest thing sometimes to do disclosures for. And so there's been a big focus on trying to improve that. And there's a lot of initiatives running around this at the same time. Whereas the G side has been somewhat covered.
For sure. And it's, as you say, that embedding that brings it together. You mentioned the sort of gap between companies that say they have responded to the pandemic or to BLM, and then to those that have that as part of the fabric of their business already. So they've gone a bit deeper than the comms and to the reactives. Do you think we're likely to see more of that this year?
So I think, well, hopefully, yes. I mean, one of the things we're going to try and do, for instance, with our work on the social transformation, we've got a series of core social indicators, we're calling them. They're not quite what you call SDG police or greenwashing police, but when we look at the expectations that we have on companies at the high level of what they should be doing, these core social indicators are kind of pointing towards them. They're signposts. They're not proxies for good performance, but they're a way of saying that if you don't meet these, it's highly unlikely you're going to be working towards meeting these expectations. Right. So if you're not at this kind of level, and I think, any company that's not meeting these expectations that we've got at the core social indicator space and are talking in terms of this is how great we are on this SDG, or this is the impact we have in this part of our operations, that disconnect is going to be quite stark. And that's hopefully what we'll be using our indicators for. So we're going to be doing 1,000 companies. So half of our cohort will be looking at this year, ready for the build up to COP. And we'll be providing some commentary, hopefully, around that to show the potential level of disconnect. I think there is a push for these kind of things to be embedded. So the Shift project, so Shift with the business human rights space, they're really looking at the culture that needs to be built into companies from the very top down, in order to integrate that respect for human rights that goes into that. So I think those cultural aspects are another way of looking at addressing the gap between the reality and the sort of the greenwashing piece that goes in there. So I think it's gonna take a while, but a lot of it. So I don't want to go off too much of a tangent, but there's a reflection around the way that companies change the way they communicate and the messages that come out. They're responding to quite big societal shifts that are happening. But the good ship capitalism is a very, very high inertia beast. Okay, so it can't change that fast. And the systems that we've got at the moment, where the market models we've got transfer wealth across regions, they polarize wealth within regions. The societal and the environmental externalities are not costed into those models. That's a huge thing to shift. And it's going to take more time, a lot of time, as we try and move towards that. So I think we'll hopefully see less of a disconnect between the work that companies are really doing and the communications that they're putting out on that. But I wouldn't expect the gap to be narrowed in the space of 12 months. Saying that, I do hope that we can try and make some commentary on that and see where those gaps really are, and see what companies are doing in terms of those basics, and whether they're meeting these, because it's really kind of inviting and appealing to companies to look for the next best thing and to focus on the short-term comms cycle that we have. But actually, a lot of companies are miserably failing to meet the basic expectations that we have of what companies are in terms of their role within society. And I think that's something we'd really want to push in our work.
Great. Well, Dan, as you say, we've covered so much ground there, and all of it vitally important to what anyone in this profession is going to be thinking about this year, ranging from disclosure to communications to changing business models, and, as you say, whole systems. And I'd love to stay and chat all day, but we're out of time for this call. So if you would like to hear more from Dan, as I was saying, I'd really encourage you to come along to our forum, which is running virtually between February 2nd and February 4th. Dan's panel is happening on day 2 of the forum, that's February 3rd, and he'll be appearing alongside experts from Ditto Sustainability, Beyond Business, and PMI and Tideway. We really hope to see you there. For a full agenda and more information, you can visit event.edie.net/forum. That's event.edie.net/forum. But for now, it's a goodbye from myself and a goodbye from Dan.
Thanks very much.